You're sitting on your couch. Your dog is staring at you. You just told him you didn't eat the last piece of chicken. He keeps staring, and somehow, deep in the part of your brain that still remembers being prey, you feel caught. Today, we find out why. Here's the thing that should quietly unsettle you before we go any further. Every major human civilization across recorded history has told stories about animals who could smell a liar. The ancient Egyptians believed the ibis, sacred bird of the god Thoth, patron of truth and judgment, would turn its back on anyone who spoke falsely in its presence. Norse sailors swore that ravens, the companions of Odin, could detect dishonesty in a man's voice and would refuse to feed from the hand of someone who had broken an oath. Indigenous oral traditions from the Pacific Northwest to the Andean highlands include accounts of dogs, horses, and birds behaving differently around deceptive people. Not trained to do so, not commanded, just knowing. When you lie in front of your own pet, do they also act suspicious? Comment down your experiences. For most of the 20th century, scientists treated these stories the way they treated most folklore. Colorful, culturally interesting, and almost certainly not literally true. They were wrong, because it turns out the question of whether animals can detect deception in humans isn't really a question about animal instinct. It's a question about trust. And it goes somewhere far stranger and more profound than anyone expected when researchers first started seriously asking it. Buckle up. The science here is genuinely remarkable, and it starts not with dogs or ravens, but with an experiment that should make every human being feel at least slightly exposed. Let's start with a landmark study, because the story of animal deception detection has a specific turning point, and it happened inside a laboratory in Kyoto, Japan. Primatologist Fumihiro Kano and his colleagues at the Primate Research Institute wanted to understand something deceptively simple. Do chimpanzees track whether a human communicator is reliable? The setup was elegant. A researcher would watch an object being hidden in one of two containers, then point toward a container to guide the chimpanzee toward the reward. Sometimes the researcher pointed honestly toward the correct container. Sometimes the researcher pointed toward the wrong one, either because they had been deceived themselves or because they were actively misleading the animal. What the researchers wanted to know was, would the chimpanzees notice the difference between an ignorant guide who was wrong by mistake and a deceptive guide who was wrong on purpose? They did. Not only did the chimpanzees stop following the guidance of the deliberately deceptive communicator faster than the ignorant one, but when eye-tracking technology was used to measure where the animals were looking during the exchange, the chimpanzees showed something remarkable. When a person they had identified as a deliberate deceiver was pointing, they spent significantly more time looking at the person's face and eyes than at the hand doing the pointing. They were, in other words, watching the liar rather than the lie. This is not a small finding. This is an animal reasoning about intent rather than just tracking outcomes, and the implications sprawl in every direction. Before we go further into what animals do when they detect deception, we need to talk about what makes detection possible in the first place. Because there's a biological reason this ability exists, and it predates every human civilization that ever built a temple or told a story about a sacred bird who could spot a liar. Deception in social animals produces physiological signals. It always has. When a vertebrate animal, mammal, bird, or reptile, generates a statement or behavior that contradicts its actual internal state, the body registers a conflict. Heart rate changes, micromuscular movements shift, cortisol and adrenaline fluctuate in patterns different from calm truth-telling. The voice changes in ways measurable by instruments, and, it turns out, detectable by animals whose sensory systems evolved in environments where those signals mattered. Dogs have approximately 300 million olfactory receptors in their noses. Humans have around 6 million. A dog doesn't just smell what you smell like. A dog smells the layered, shifting chemical narrative of what your body is doing right now. Stress hormones have a scent. Adrenaline has a scent. The specific biochemical cocktail your body produces when it is generating a falsehood, elevated cortisol, slight cardiovascular spike, suppressed breath, is a distinct chemical signature, And dogs evolved in close proximity to humans for roughly 15,000 years, not just as companions, but as partners in survival. A dog that could tell the difference between a calm human and a stressed, deceptive one was a dog with a survival advantage. That trait, over millennia, got selected. Hard. This is the biological foundation, not mystical, not metaphorical. Deception has a smell, and we handed the animals with the sharpest noses in the vertebrate world thousands of years to learn it. If the Kyoto chimpanzee studies showed that primates reason about intent, a series of studies conducted over the following decade expanded that picture into something much broader and much more personally relevant to anyone who has ever tried to convince a dog that bath time is actually fun. Researchers at the University of Veterinary Medicine in Vienna, working with Dr. Ludwig Huber's Comparative Cognition Lab, ran a series of experiments specifically designed to test whether domestic dogs track human reliability over time. The methodology was straightforward, which is often the mark of the best science. A handler would show a dog a treat hidden under one of two cups and then point toward it. Dogs already attuned to human pointing, a skill, fascinatingly, that wolves do not share despite being genetically nearly identical, would follow the cue consistently. But then the handler began pointing toward the wrong cup. Dogs who experienced this deception adjusted their behavior. They stopped following the cue. More importantly, they transferred their skepticism. When a new handler came in and pointed accurately, the deceived dog still showed elevated hesitation, a wariness generalized not just to the liar, but to the act of being pointed at by a person. Their trust in human communicative gestures had been measurably damaged by exposure to a dishonest communicator, and it didn't fully recover within the span of the experiment. Let that sit for a moment. A dog, deceived by one person, became more cautious with strangers. They hadn't just tracked a specific liar. They had updated their model of how trustworthy humans are in general. That is sophisticated. That is a form of reasoning that requires memory, generalization, and something that looks unsettlingly like wisdom earned through disappointment. The ability to detect human deception isn't limited to the species we expect it from. Two additional cases deserve your full attention, because they pull the story in directions that are harder to explain away. Horses. Research conducted at the Equine Research Center in Newmarket, England, and subsequently expanded by equine behavior specialists at the University of Sussex, established that horses pay extraordinarily close attention to human facial expressions. They can distinguish photographs of happy versus angry human faces and show measurable stress responses to images of angry people. Stress responses that include shifting weight, elevating heart rate, and showing the whites of their eyes, what horse handlers call the worry eye. But the more interesting finding emerged from observational work on handlers and their horses over time. Horses whose primary handlers used calm, consistent, honest communication, meaning they did not employ bait-and-switch training techniques where a reward was implied and withheld, showed significantly lower baseline cortisol levels and faster learning curves than horses whose handlers frequently used deceptive cues. The horses weren't just reading emotional state. They were building, over time, an accurate internal model of whether a particular human could be trusted to mean what they were communicating. When that trust was broken, it was broken slowly. When it was damaged, recovery required patient and consistent honesty over weeks or months. Anyone who has worked with a horse that was mishandled earlier in life knows this intuitively. The science simply confirmed what generations of horsemen already understood. Then there are corvids, ravens and crows, members of the family Corvidae, possess brain structures that, despite being organized entirely differently from mammalian brains, produce cognitive abilities that rival those of great apes. They plan for the future. They use tools. They remember individual human faces and hold grudges across years. A crow harassed by a researcher in one context will alarm call at that researcher's face specifically, not at other humans, not at the researcher's clothing, but at that face, for up to 5 years afterward. Studies conducted at the Konrad Lorenz Research Center in Austria found that ravens closely observe whether a human has seen where food was hidden before attempting to retrieve it from behind an occluder. If the human witnessed the hiding, The raven waits for the person to leave before going for the food. If the human did not witness the hiding, the raven retrieves it immediately, with no waiting behavior. The ravens, in other words, were tracking what the human knew, modeling human knowledge states and adjusting their own behavior accordingly. This is called theory of mind, the ability to understand that another being has a mental state distinct from your own, with different information and different beliefs. Ravens have it, and they use it specifically to reason about whether a human is likely to interfere with them, which is, structurally, exactly the same cognitive process that would let them detect when a human's stated intentions don't match their likely behavior. Here's the thing that should make your brain go quiet for a moment. Every species we've looked at, chimpanzees, dogs, horses, ravens, arrived at deception detection through entirely separate evolutionary pathways. Primates developed social reasoning in the context of large, complex group hierarchies, where knowing who was reliable was survival critical. Dogs developed it through 15,000 years of coevolution with a species, us, whose communicative honesty directly determined whether they ate or went hungry. Horses developed it through a prey animal's life or death need to distinguish trustworthy threats from false alarms. Corvids developed it through a scavenger's constant need to model the intentions of larger animals who might take their food. Different pressures, different timelines, different neural architectures. Same result. Animals that live in close proximity to humans, or in complex social groups where deception is a real variable, converge independently on the ability to detect it, which tells us something profound. This is not an accident of evolution. Deception detection is not a quirk. It is a fundamental feature of social intelligence. Wherever social intelligence evolves, to a sufficient degree, the ability to detect dishonesty evolves alongside it. Deception is evolutionarily expensive for the deceiver. It requires holding two conflicting models simultaneously: what is real and what you are performing. The physiological cost of that cognitive load is measurable and real, and animals with sufficiently refined sensory or social cognition can read that cost. When your dog stares at you after you've said something false, they are not performing a charming bit of theater. They are doing exactly what 15,000 years of evolution designed them to do: read the human, and finding the signal that doesn't match. The practical implications here are stranger and richer than they first appear. It means that the emotional quality of your relationship with animals is not simply a product of what you do for them: feeding, care, play. It's a product of how consistent you are, how accurately your behavior predicts what you communicate, whether the signals you send match the reality you create. The Kyoto chimpanzees didn't stop trusting deceptive handlers because the handlers were unkind. They stopped because the handlers were unpredictable in a specific way. Their communications couldn't be relied upon. And that unpredictability, for a social animal, is one of the most destabilizing things that can exist in an environment. Trust, in animal cognition research, is not a soft concept. It is a predictive model. It is the animal's working theory of how accurately your behavior will match your signals. When that model holds up consistently, the animal is calm, cooperative, and capable of learning. When that model breaks down, through deception, through inconsistency, through saying one thing and doing another, the animal's cognitive resources get redirected from learning and cooperating toward monitoring and self-protection. Your dog, your horse, your parrot, if you have one, is running a continuous reliability assessment on you. Not consciously, not maliciously, the same way water runs downhill, because that's what the architecture of their mind was built to do. And 15,000 years of shared history means they're very, very good at it. So do animals know when a human is lying to them? The complete answer is layered, and it spans far more of biology and time than the question first suggests. The physiological foundation, the fact that deception produces detectable biochemical signals, is as old as vertebrate nervous systems, hundreds of millions of years old. Long before there were humans to deceive anyone, the body's response to internal conflict was already generating signals that the outside world could, in principle, read. The social cognitive layer, the capacity to track reliability, model intent, and build trust relationships over time, evolved in species that lived in complex social environments and needed to navigate unreliable communicators. That's millions of years of primate evolution, tens of thousands of years of dog-human coevolution, and parallel development across corvids, horses, and dozens of other species that haven't been studied as closely. What the last 2 decades of research have established, clearly and repeatedly, is that the animals most embedded in human social life, dogs especially, but horses, primates, and certain birds close behind, are not passive recipients of our care and commands. They are active social reasoners, continuously building and revising models of human reliability, and using those models to decide how much they can afford to trust what we're telling them. The next time your dog watches you eat and you insist there's nothing on your plate, they know. They don't know it the way you know things, but they know it the way a body knows the difference between a calm heartbeat and a stressed one, the way a nervous system knows the difference between a consistent signal and a disrupted one. They know it because they were built to know it, and we built them that way, across thousands of years of living together, by making honesty worth tracking. That is either a reason to feel exposed or a reason to feel connected, probably both, as it usually is with the oldest relationships. If this story drew you in, there's plenty more to discover. Like and subscribe so you never miss what's next.